The dust settled across the empty highway as Frank Henderson wiped the sweat from his weathered brow and gazed out at the endless stretch of scrubland that had been his home for nearly 40 years now. He was a man who had grown comfortable with silence and solitude after his wife Margaret passed on some 15 years back and his children scattered to the cities in search of dreams he could never quite understand. The ranch had become smaller over time as he sold off parcels to keep up with the bills, but what remained was his, and that mattered more than acreage ever could. On this particular afternoon in late summer, when the heat shimmered off the earth-like waves on an invisible ocean, Frank had driven into town for supplies and was making his way back along the old county road. That was when he saw her. At first he thought it might be a mirage or perhaps an injured animal lying near the fence line, but as his truck drew closer his heart began to hammer in his chest with an urgency he had not felt in years. A young woman lay crumpled against the wooden posts, wearing nothing but what appeared to be a torn and bloodied sheet wrapped loosely around her trembling frame. Frank slammed on the brakes and the truck skidded to a halt, sending up a cloud of red dust that hung in the still air like a question mark. He sat frozen behind the wheel for just a moment, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. Then he heard it. A voice so faint and desperate it seemed to come from somewhere deep within the earth itself. "Please," she whispered through cracked and swollen lips. "Help me." Those two words shattered whatever paralysis had held him, and Frank was out of the truck, moving faster than his 68-year-old legs had moved in a decade. He approached carefully, not wanting to frighten her any more than she already was, and knelt down in the dirt beside her. His hands shook as he reached out to touch her shoulder, and he could feel the heat of fever radiating from her skin. "What happened to you?" he asked, though he knew she might not have the strength to answer. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, and he saw in them a depth of suffering that made his own hardships seem small and insignificant by comparison. She tried to speak, but no words came, and her eyes rolled back as consciousness slipped away from her like water through fingers. Frank did not hesitate. He gathered her up as gently as he could, wrapping the sheet more securely around her body, and carried her to his truck. She weighed almost nothing, and he thought of baby birds fallen from nests and how fragile life could be. The drive back to the ranch seemed to take forever, though it could not have been more than 20 minutes. He kept glancing over at her pale face, willing her to keep breathing and praying to a God he had not spoken to much since Margaret died. When they finally reached the house, he carried her inside and laid her on the bed in what had once been his daughter Sarah's room. The room still held the faint scent of lilacs from sachets Margaret had made years ago, and the afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, casting gentle patterns on the walls. Frank moved quickly now, with a purpose that felt almost like youth returning to his bones. He fetched water and clean towels and the first aid kit from the bathroom cabinet. As he carefully cleaned the cuts and scrapes that covered her arms and legs, he noticed the bruises that mottled her skin in shades of purple and yellow and green. Someone had hurt this girl badly, and the thought filled him with a quiet rage that surprised him. But anger would not help her now, so he pushed it aside and focused on the task at hand. He cleaned her wounds with antiseptic and bandaged the worst of them, then covered her with a quilt his grandmother had stitched nearly a century ago. Her fever concerned him most, so he placed cool cloths on her forehead and checked her pulse every few minutes. It was weak but steady, and he took comfort in that. As the sun began to set, painting the room in shades of amber and gold, Frank pulled up a chair beside the bed and settled in to keep watch. He thought about calling the sheriff, but something stopped him. This girl had crawled to his fence line for a reason, and until he knew what that reason was, he would protect her silence as fiercely as he would protect her life. The night passed slowly. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes whimpering or crying out words he could not understand, and he would speak to her in low, soothing tones the way he used to talk to frightened horses. "Easy now," he would say. "You are safe here. Nobody is going to hurt you." By morning her fever had broken and she slept more peacefully. Frank dozed in the chair, his body stiff and aching but his heart strangely light. When he woke, the sun was already climbing high and he could hear the chickens fussing in the yard demanding their breakfast. He stood slowly, working the kinks out of his back, and looked down at the girl. Her eyes were open and watching him with a mixture of fear and gratitude that made his throat tight. "I am Frank," he said simply. "This is my home and you are welcome to stay as long as you need." She opened her mouth to speak, but he held up a hand. "You do not have to tell me anything right now," he said. "First we need to get some food in you and make sure those wounds are healing proper." He helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her, and brought her water, which she drank in small, careful sips. Then he made her soft scrambled eggs and toast and watched as she ate slowly, her hands shaking with weakness. Over the next few days a routine emerged. Frank would tend to his animals and do his morning chores, then check on her and bring her meals. He changed her bandages and made sure she drank plenty of water and took the antibiotics he had left over from when he had pneumonia the winter before. She slept most of the time, her body doing the hard work of healing while he kept watch. On the 4th day she spoke her first full sentence. "My name is Emma." Frank smiled. "That is a fine name," he said. "My mother's name was Emma." She looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her years. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He thought about that for a moment. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "And because I remember what it is like to feel alone in this world." Tears welled up in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks, and he handed her a tissue and looked away to give her privacy in her grief. As the days turned into weeks, Emma grew stronger. She began to move around the house helping with small tasks, and gradually Frank learned her story. She had been traveling with a man she thought she loved, a man who had promised her a better life far from the broken home and broken promises of her childhood. But the dream had turned into a nightmare. He had become violent and controlling, and when she tried to leave he had beaten her and left her for dead on that empty stretch of highway. She had crawled for what felt like miles before reaching Frank's fence. "I thought I was going to die," she said quietly one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of crimson and purple. "But then I saw your fence and I thought maybe if I could just reach it, maybe someone would find me." Frank nodded. "I am glad you did not give up," he said. Emma stayed through the autumn. She helped around the ranch, feeding the chickens and tending the small vegetable garden, and slowly the color returned to her cheeks and the light returned to her eyes. Frank found himself looking forward to her company at breakfast and the way she hummed softly while doing dishes in the evening. The house felt less empty now, less like a museum of memories and more like a home again. One afternoon in late October, as they worked together mending a section of fence, Emma stopped and looked at him. "You saved my life," she said. He shook his head. "You saved your own life by having the courage to ask for help," he replied. "I just happened to be the one who heard you." She smiled, then a real smile that reached her eyes. "I think maybe we saved each other," she said. Winter came, and with it a quietness that settled over the land like a blanket. Emma had talked about moving on, about finding work in town or maybe going back to school, but as the weeks passed those conversations became less frequent. One evening as they sat by the fire, Frank asked her the question that had been on his mind. "Do you want to stay?" he said. "Not because you feel obligated, but because you want to." Emma looked into the flames for a long time before answering. "I feel like I have been searching for home my whole life," she said. "And I think maybe I have found it here." Frank felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been tight and bound for longer than he could remember. "Then stay," he said. "For as long as you like." The years that followed were gentle ones. Emma took online classes and got her degree while helping Frank run the ranch. She was smart and resourceful and had a way with the animals that reminded him of his daughter. They fell into an easy rhythm, two people who had both known loneliness, finding comfort in simple companionship. They worked side by side during the day, and in the evenings they would sit on the porch or by the fire sharing stories and silence in equal measure. Frank taught her about the land and the seasons and how to read the sky for weather. Emma brought laughter back into the house and reminded him that life still held surprises. On Emma's 25th birthday, Frank gave her a deed. She opened it with trembling hands and looked up at him in shock. "This is half the ranch," she said. Frank nodded. "You have earned it," he said. "And more than that, you have given an old man a reason to keep going. I want to know that when I am gone, this place will be cared for by someone who loves it." Emma threw her arms around him, crying and laughing at the same time. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." As Frank grew older and his steps grew slower, Emma took on more of the work. She hired help when they needed it and made improvements to the property, always consulting with Frank and respecting his opinions. The ranch began to thrive again in ways it had not in decades. One spring morning, Frank woke to find the sun streaming through his window and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. He lay there for a moment, feeling content in a way he had not felt since Margaret was alive. He thought about that day years ago when he had found Emma bleeding and desperate by the roadside. He thought about how one act of kindness had changed both their lives. Some people might say he had saved her, but Frank knew the truth. They had saved each other. And in doing so they had discovered that family is not always about blood. Sometimes it is about showing up. About offering help when it is needed. About choosing every day to care for another person not because you have to but because you want to. As Frank made his way downstairs and saw Emma at the stove flipping pancakes and humming that same tune she always hummed, he felt a profound gratitude wash over him. Life had given him a second chance at connection. And he had been wise enough to take it. The morning light filled the kitchen with warmth and outside the land stretched away in all directions patient and eternal. And in that moment everything was exactly as it should be.